What a dismissive avoidant feels at each stage of no contact, let's talk about something that's confusing, frustrating, and at times deeply painful. You're going no contact with someone who has a dismissive avoidant attachment style. At first, you might assume they're not reacting, they don't care, I meant nothing. But that's not the whole story. You're looking at the surface behavior, not the emotional mechanics underneath. Let's break down what actually happens, because dismissive avoidants do feel, but they feel differently and often delayed. And when you understand this, you stop making it about your own worth and start seeing the patterns more clearly. When a dismissive avoidant enters the initial stage of no contact, what they feel isn't pain, regret, or longing, not yet. The dominant sensation is relief. It's the kind of relief that comes from escaping something that felt overwhelming, not because the other person was too much, but because intimacy itself felt like pressure. The dismissive avoidant has learned, often since childhood, that closeness can be unpredictable, demanding, or even unsafe. So when a relationship ends or when someone pulls away, the first emotional response is a loosening of that internal tension they've been carrying, an exhale. This doesn't mean they didn't care. It means that for them, the connection had become too emotionally stimulating. Even positive intimacy, deep conversations, regular check-ins, expressed affection can activate their subconscious fear of being consumed, losing independence, or being vulnerable. And when no contact begins, it brings a wave of spaciousness. It's a moment where they feel back in control, able to reset their autonomy. There's no one expecting emotional access, no one seeking connection. In that quiet, they feel safe. But it's a mistake to interpret this relief as indifference. What's happening is not emotional numbness, but emotional distance. It's how they regulate themselves. They don't run because they didn't feel, they run because they did feel, more than they were comfortable admitting. But in the early phase of no contact, all of that is buried under a coping mechanism that says, now I can breathe. This breathing room becomes their temporary peace. It creates the illusion that separation was the solution, that being alone equals being balanced. They often don't reflect on the depth of the relationship during this stage. Instead, they lean into surface thoughts, getting back into routines, distracting themselves with work, social activities, or solo hobbies. Their mind shifts away from emotional introspection and toward distraction-based grounding. And if the relationship had recurring emotional discussions or conflicts, they feel an extra layer of freedom. To them, those moments didn't always feel like bonding, they felt like obligation. So in the silence of no contact, there's a psychological release from what they unconsciously perceived as emotional demand. This is why people who were in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant often feel so confused. You expect them to miss you right away. You expect the silence to hit them like it hits you. But instead, they look fine. They may even seem happier. They post, they smile, they move forward. And that disconnect between your pain and their apparent peace can feel like rejection, even erasure. But that's not what's happening beneath the surface. The dismissive avoidant is not dancing on the grave of the relationship. They're simply giving their nervous system a break from something they weren't equipped to process in real time. Relief is just the first layer. It's a survival layer. It's how they convince themselves that their independence has been preserved and that everything is back under control. The emotions, the memories, the deeper meaning, those haven't disappeared. They've just been stored for later. For now, relief is the dominant experience. But it's only the beginning. After the initial wave of relief passes, the dismissive avoidant typically enters a stage where they rely heavily on rationalization. It's as if they switch from emotional avoidance to mental gymnastics, constructing logical explanations to justify the breakup or the silence of no contact. They tell themselves stories like, we weren't compatible, they were too emotional, or this relationship was never going to work anyway. These thoughts aren't just casual reflections, they're essential defense mechanisms that keep them from feeling vulnerable emotions that threaten their sense of self-sufficiency. During this stage, their mind becomes their sanctuary. By analyzing, categorizing, and labeling everything, they keep themselves safely in the realm of thought, where feelings can't easily intrude. They might replay conversations, recalling moments when they felt criticized or overwhelmed, and use those memories to fortify their belief that ending the relationship or maintaining distance was the right call. Every memory becomes proof for their narrative. This mental loop is designed not only to protect them from sadness or grief, but to reaffirm their deep-seated belief that closeness is inherently risky or draining. This rationalization can seem cold and calculating to someone on the outside, especially to the partner left behind who may still be in pain or longing for answers. The dismissive avoidance focus on logic over emotion can give the impression they never cared or that they've already moved on. But their intellectualization isn't proof of indifference. It's proof of discomfort with emotional exposure. By living in the realm of why it wouldn't have worked, they don't have to feel the hurt of what's been lost or the fear of what real intimacy might require of them. They might also idealize independence during this period, doubling down on beliefs like, I'm better alone, or I don't need anyone. It's a self-reassuring strategy that paints dependence or connection as weakness while elevating detachment as strength. They might compare themselves to friends who are also single or highlight examples of relationships they believe are dysfunctional, further bolstering the idea that avoiding closeness is the wise choice. These comparisons act like mental armor, keeping them insulated from the vulnerability they're trying so hard to avoid. Meanwhile, beneath all this logic, there's a quiet tension. Because rationalization can suppress emotion, but it can't erase it entirely. Feelings of missing someone, regrets, or loneliness might bubble up in brief moments, late at night, during mundane tasks, or when they see a reminder of the person they cut off. Yet, instead of exploring those feelings, they usually double down on their justifications, pushing themselves further into the safety of their mental fortress. For dismissive avoidance, this period of rationalization is both protective and limiting. It gives them control, which they crave, but it also locks them in a rigid mindset that leaves little room for growth or healing. They believe their analysis is objective truth, but in reality, it's a filter designed to keep them comfortable, far from the discomfort of emotional honesty and genuine vulnerability. As time goes on and the silence of no contact lingers, the dismissive avoidant slowly enters a more emotionally activated stage, though it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Unlike other attachment styles that may feel emotions quickly and intensely, dismissive avoidants tend to experience emotional awareness in a more delayed, subtle way. This is the phase where emotional echoes begin to surface. They're not necessarily overwhelmed by sadness or guilt, but they begin to notice a quiet, persistent sense of something missing. It's not always loud or obvious. It comes in waves, often in moments when they least expect it. At first, it might just be a passing thought. A memory triggered by a smell, a familiar song, or walking past a place they once visited with their partner. They may find themselves scrolling through old photos or rereading a message thread. These actions aren't intentional searches for reconnection. They're reflexive, often catching the avoidant off guard. The very silence they once found comforting now begins to feel hollow. They're still unlikely to label these feelings as missing you or feeling lonely. Those words are too vulnerable, too exposing. But internally, they're starting to notice the void. What's important here is the emotional dissonance they experience. On one hand, they've told themselves the relationship wasn't necessary, they've rationalized their reasons for leaving or staying silent. But on the other hand, something feels unfinished. Something lingers. And because dismissive avoidants struggle with emotional language, even in their own internal dialogue, this discomfort can feel like restlessness, irritation, or vague melancholy. They may not say, I feel sad. Instead, they feel bored, unmotivated, or slightly off without fully understanding why. This phase can be deeply confusing for them because the emotions don't match their previous narrative. They already decided. This relationship wasn't right. They already moved on. So why does part of them still feel the absence? They may try to dismiss these feelings quickly, distract themselves with work, hobbies, or casual flings. But the emotional echo remains. It doesn't demand action, but it doesn't go away either. It's like a low hum in the background of their mind, occasionally getting louder when things go quiet. One of the key traits of this stage is their resistance to admitting vulnerability, even to themselves. Instead of thinking, I miss the connection, they might frame it as, I miss having someone around. They depersonalize the experience to keep emotional distance. But the truth is, they do miss you. Not just the role you played in their life, but your energy, your presence, and the way you made them feel safe, seen, understood, even if they couldn't fully receive it at the time. Because their default coping style is to suppress, they often underestimate how deep the impact of connection can go until it's no longer available. The emotional echo becomes their first real confrontation with what they've pushed away. It doesn't always prompt immediate action, but it begins to quietly challenge the certainty of their previous decisions. It's the start of emotional contradiction, the awareness that something they claimed not to need is starting to be felt in its absence. And though they may never say it out loud, this is the moment the silence starts to get to them. At a certain point in no contact after the initial relief, and the rationalizations have worn thin, and the emotional echo has begun to hum in the background, the dismissive avoidant may feel an urge to reach out. But this impulse isn't driven by clarity or emotional openness. It's not a heartfelt apology or a sudden realization of deep love. Instead, it's usually subtle, cautious, and wrapped in neutrality. They might send a casual message, a meme, a "Hey, how have you been?" or even a reaction to one of your stories. These gestures seem small and harmless on the surface, but underneath, they serve a very specific function to test the waters. This is what makes it so confusing for the person on the receiving end. You might think, if they miss me, why not just say it? Why not be honest? But for the dismissive avoidant, direct vulnerability still feels like danger. Admitting they miss you means confronting feelings they've spent their whole life trying to manage by avoiding. So instead, they reach out in a way that maintains emotional control. If you respond warmly, it reassures them. If you don't respond at all, they can quickly retreat without feeling too exposed. It's not about rebuilding trust or intimacy at this point. It's about safety. This behavior often looks like emotional inconsistency. One day they might engage, the next they disappear again. It's not intentional cruelty or manipulation. It's inner conflict. They're pulled between the desire for connection and the fear of what that connection will require of them. Reaching out is like dipping a toe into the water, not diving in. They want reassurance without commitment. They crave closeness without sacrificing their sense of independence. And because they struggle to articulate what they feel, these small gestures are the only safe way they know to express it. They also use these interactions to gather data. Have you moved on? Are you still angry? Are you emotionally available? Your response gives them a sense of where they stand, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're ready for anything deeper. That's why people who re-engage with dismissive avoidance after no contact often find themselves confused again. The avoidant may reappear with warmth one week and pull back the next. It's not because they're playing games, it's because they're managing a deep fear of emotional dependence. What's critical to understand is that this moment of reaching out doesn't automatically signal growth or readiness. It's a reflex more than a revelation. They're responding to the discomfort of distance, but they're not necessarily ready to do the work to sustain closeness. That's why it's important not to interpret their message at face value. It might mean they miss you, yes, but more often it means they miss the comfort of knowing you're still there. And unless they've done inner work, that's usually all they're seeking in that moment. Reassurance, not reconnection. Eventually, the dismissive avoidant arrives at a psychological crossroads. After the initial relief fades, the rationalizations start to lose their strength, and the emotional echo becomes harder to ignore. They're left with an internal dilemma that demands a decision: grow or repeat. This is the most critical stage because it determines whether the cycle of avoidance will continue or whether real change is possible. At this point, the avoidant has often begun to feel the consequences of their emotional detachment, not just in relationships, but in other areas of life as well. The space they created to protect themselves now feels emptier than expected. They may notice that they don't feel fully connected to anyone, or that their sense of peace is more like emotional numbness. Loneliness creeps in, not in a loud or desperate way, but as a quiet, persistent realization that their independence hasn't delivered the fulfillment they hoped it would. For some, this is the beginning of self-awareness. For others, it's the moment they double down on their avoidance. If they choose to grow, it usually starts with discomfort. They begin to question their own patterns, even if reluctantly. They may look back on the relationship and acknowledge their role in its breakdown. Not just logically, but emotionally. They start to see how their fear of vulnerability, their need for control, and their resistance to intimacy created walls that ultimately left them isolated. Growth for a dismissive avoidant isn't a light switch moment. It's slow, humbling, and often painful. It may involve therapy, deep reflection, or a willingness to sit with the very feelings they once avoided at all costs. But growth also requires risk. To break the cycle, they have to be willing to let someone in, not just halfway, but fully. They have to challenge the belief that closeness is dangerous, that emotional need is weakness, and that independence is only valid when it means solitude. This kind of change doesn't happen overnight, and not everyone is ready for it. Some will make the choice to lean in, to reconnect in a more honest way, and to do the difficult emotional work that intimacy demands. Others, however, will choose the loop. The emotional discomfort becomes too much. The pull toward closeness feels threatening, so they retreat into familiar patterns. They might tell themselves the relationship just wasn't right, or that some people just aren't meant to be together. These aren't just excuses, they're coping strategies. Repeating the cycle allows them to avoid the vulnerability of change. It allows them to stay in the comfort zone of emotional distance, even if it leaves them feeling increasingly disconnected. This stage is defining not because of what the avoidant feels, but because of what they do. The feelings are real, missing you, regretting parts of the past, sensing that something important slipped away. But whether they use those feelings as fuel for growth or bury them under a fresh layer of avoidance is the true turning point. It's the moment that separates emotional maturity from repeated patterns. And while you may never see the outcome directly, know that this inner conflict is very real for them, even if it remains entirely hidden from view. So, what does all of this mean for you? It means that just because someone doesn't express emotions the way you do, doesn't mean they're not feeling something. Dismissive avoidants have a unique emotional timeline, slow to react, resistant to vulnerability, and deeply protective of their independence. But behind the silence, the logic, the detachment, there's still an emotional journey unfolding. One they may never speak about, one they may not even fully understand themselves. But here's the most important part: you don't have to wait for their growth to begin yours. Understanding their experience isn't about excusing behavior or reopening old doors. It's about reclaiming your peace, your clarity, and your power. Because someone else's delay in processing doesn't mean you have to delay your healing. Let them feel what they feel when they're ready to feel it. Let them reach out or not. Let them grow or repeat. But you move forward with intention, self-respect, and grace. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And most of all, thank you for valuing yourself enough to seek clarity where confusion once lived. Take care of your heart. You're not hard to love. You just needed someone who isn't afraid to hold what's real. Goodbye for now, and until next time, stay kind to yourself. You're doing better than you think.